This is Unit 3, Federal Framework for Disaster Recovery. The unit objectives are to 1. Identify the key laws administered by various federal agencies. 2. Classify which aspects of the laws apply to the phases of the emergency management disaster life cycle. And 3. Explain how the National Disaster Response and Recovery frameworks relate to disaster planning. In order for you not to get behind in this class, you should have completed all requirements for Units 1 and 2, including quiz number 1 by now. This week, you should read Chapter 4 in the Schwab book. It's a relatively short chapter, but it's packed with a lot of useful information. After you read the chapter and watch this video, make sure that you participate in the forum on Canvas. Find an article in the news that discusses the federal role in response to Hurricane Harvey and discuss how this relates to the readings. So, Chapter 4, the Federal Framework for Disaster Recovery. This table in Chapter 4, Table 4.1, Disaster Management Laws Administered by FEMA, provide a snapshot of the various laws going back to the Disaster Relief Act of 1950, and includes the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968, which we'll talk a little bit about here in a minute, looking at NFIP, flood insurance, and the Stafford Act, and the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, Homeland Security Act of 2002, and the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Act, Reform Act of 2006. Sorry about that. Each of these laws are described here in the table looking at the disaster management life cycle, including mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And this table provides a update of the way in which the policy is addressed in these life cycle phases from each of the laws. Well, I want to get in here a little bit talking about flood insurance. There's a lot of misconceptions about what flood insurance is, how flood insurance works, and who pays for flood insurance. Flood insurance is not like homeowners insurance. It is actually underwritten by the federal government, not the private sector. There are private sector folks, companies, and agents that will service the policy. So you may think it's a private sector policy because your private insurance agent will give you a flood insurance policy, but in fact they're acting as a representative to the federal government. The way it works is that homeowners pay premiums each month, and that goes into a pool to pay claims. But if there's a major disaster and there's not enough money in that pool, then the federal government is responsible for underwriting the cost to pay out to homeowners following major minor disasters. Now, the interesting thing is that banks require flood insurance for homes in flood zones, but yet it's the federal government that underwrites the cost of the flood insurance. So we're going to see here a little discussion from an insurance agent from Fort Lauderdale talking about how this works.
In Fort Lauderdale, Brad. Hey, Brad. You are an insurance adjuster?
Yeah, Tom. How are you doing today?
Great. Are you an insurance adjuster?
Yeah, I'm an insurance adjuster in Florida. I've been one for about 8 years now, and I've worked both sides of the industry as a public adjuster, which we have in Florida that represents policyholders, homeowners and such, and also for the insurance companies. And I've been NFIP certified to do flood claims.
So how does it work, and how do you respond to people who say that the only reason that Florida real estate has any value at all is because the feds and the state are basically subsidizing the risk factor of hurricanes and floods?
Well, one of the things I think you have to be careful with is the word subsidy, meaning that the government is paying a portion of it. I mean, these policies are rated and they have premiums, and we pay for these. And, of course, the tax dollars go into it as well. For the NFIP, the premiums are pretty low, but that's because they spread the risk across the entire country, which is part of the problem with insurance in general, be it health or homeowners or otherwise, that we limit the risk pool, so the premiums are high. That's our problem in Florida with hurricane insurance. But for the NFIP, I mean,
that's the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP.
Yeah. Yeah, NFIP. And by the way, all flood insurance policies are NFIP. Private insurers don't write the policies. Much the way banks do with loans sometimes, they service the policies for the policyholders, but they don't write the policies. It all comes out of the federal kitty, so to speak.
So it's basically a Fannie Mae loan or a Freddie Mac loan. It's not Chelsea Bank loan or whatever.
Exactly right. And the problem with the flood insurance as well is because it's one of these kind of government pools of money, it's all run through FEMA, and FEMA has a limited budget. So depending on how they allocate that budget, the NFIP may or may not have money to pay the claims. And that's the problem up in the Northeast right now is the budget is empty. There's no money to pay the claims, and they need this money to go through Congress to pay the claims. One quick thing, I know that to bring a political note into this, and something you'll probably appreciate. I don't know if you remember during Hurricane Katrina, Trent Lott, the former Senate Majority Leader, had a house right there in the Gulf of Mississippi that was destroyed by Katrina, $750,000. Now, incidentally, he did have an NFIP policy, which only covers $200,000, but was on the floor of the Senate and had George Bush down there railing about getting money to help these people because, of course, him and all his friends in his rich neighborhood lost their homes. Yet we don't have any politicians up in the Northeast who appear to have lost their homes because of this, and now the money's just getting stuck in Congress. Nobody wants to push it through.
Well, it's the Republicans who are stuck in Congress. It's not the Democrats. The Democrats are perfectly willing to jump in on this thing, as is the administration. But there's this libertarian bunch of the Republicans in Congress who I think reflect the same point of view as Nicole, as my guest, which is that the free market is the beginning and end of everything, and it should be defining everything. And anything that government gets involved with distorts the free market, and therefore government should play no role in this. And I think
a point. I don't mean to interrupt you. Sorry, a point that's kind of lost on them with that argument too is the free market dictates that we have to have this insurance. At least in Florida, I can speak. If you own a mortgage and you live in the flood zone, which is dictated by the NFIP, you're required to carry flood insurance. You don't have a choice. I mean, the only person you can buy from is from the NFIP. That's it. So it's the free market dictating that we have to have this.
So it's not, but that's not the free market dictating it. That's the government dictating it, is it not?
No, it's the mortgage companies. It's the banks who hold your mortgage. Part of your mortgage. Just like you have to have homeowners insurance, they require you to carry flood insurance.
Right. So they're just covering their butts.
Exactly. And of course, most of these financial institutions that are the banks who also do mortgages, a lot of them are also insurance companies or have subsidiaries for insurance companies. So it's all part of the same, entity, if you will. They require this insurance, but none of the insurance companies will write the policies, so they leave it for the government to take care of and then force us to buy them.
Right. Now, what is the fund that ran out that has to be replenished with this legislation from Congress? I mean, if you've got a national flood insurance program, covers the entire nation, people all across the nation are paying into it, whether they live along a little stream in Oklahoma or they live on the West Coast or they live in Sandy Hook. It doesn't matter. Or not Sandy Hook, the ocean side.
Sure.
Shouldn't that be a federal pool of money, or are they regional? Do they operate as regional pools of money or state pools of money? How does that work?
No, it's all FEMA. My understanding is this is all through FEMA, and it's all part of FEMA's budget. The money all goes into the federal coffers, and FEMA's budget certain amounts of money. The thing with the flood insurance program, anybody can buy into it, but only people who are in designated flood zones are required to have it.
Right, but my question is, why are they out of money? Why do they need Congress to appropriate money for them?
It's the same reason my Social Security doesn't have any money, because it was in there in a bank account somewhere, and they came in and took it and used it for other things and left a bunch of IOUs. There's just no money in the budget for it.
Could it be that FEMA didn't so much use it for other things as that we've had global weirding? I mean, Joplin, Missouri got wiped out, and that cost FEMA a fortune. You had hundreds and hundreds of tornadoes in the last year that took out big chunks of the Midwest. FEMA had to go into all of those places. You had Hurricane Katrina a couple of years ago. FEMA was down there. I mean, could it just be that FEMA is just tapped out?
Well, absolutely. But again, my understanding is that this is a yearly budget thing. All the money goes into FEMA, and they allocate a certain portion of their budget to pay FEMA claims. And when the money runs out yearly, the money runs out yearly. And when you have all these disasters kind of compounding each other, and they don't increase that budget amount or allocate any additional money for that, the money's just not there.
Right. But people in good faith paid into this federal flood insurance program, and now the Republicans in Congress are saying, no, we're not going to pay off on your policy, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. Part of the problem, of course, also is the premiums are ridiculously low. It's one of the things, and I live in Florida and I pay paid as well, and I hate to see my bills go up. But I mean, to insure the max amount in Florida, and I live in an area that's a flood zone, my premium bill is $300 and change a month, and that covers $250,000 for my building, and
that's a lot of money.
My personal property. $300 a year. Excuse me.
Oh, $300 a year. Okay.
Not a $300 a year.
Yeah.
So, and the premiums are pretty low, and my understanding is that's pretty. That's a.
Now, could that be because they cap out these policies at $250,000?
Well, yeah, absolutely, and that's another thing as well. These are very limited policies. This isn't like your homeowner's policy, and I know you had one caller previously who talked about how the stuff in his basement wasn't covered. That's absolutely right. These policies cover limited stuff. It's not like your homeowner's policy where you have a covered loss, and after deductible, they pay you to replace it.
These are kind of the flood equivalent of Walmart's health insurance policy. If you're really, really sick and you have really, really big bills, it might help out a little bit. But otherwise, if you spend just a couple $1,000s a year and go see the doctor when your kid breaks his arm, you're still out of pocket. And
the difference is you have a choice to buy that. Well, to some degree, you have a choice to buy that Walmart health insurance policy, but you have no choice. The NFIP is the only game in town.
Okay, Brad, thank you for the call and thanks for all the information. It's much appreciated.
So just to say a few words more about the NFIP before moving on to the Stafford Act. The premiums are quite low. You can hear the agent was saying that in Fort Lauderdale he lives in a flood zone and paying $350 a year, although that was from a few years ago. But nevertheless, there was a bill in Congress a couple of years back that had attempted to increase the cost of flood insurance, called the Bigger Waters Act, and that actually would have raised flood insurance quite significantly, but was opposed by a lot of coastal states because of fears that insurance rates would have gone way too high. So we're pretty much back to where we were, as premiums are pretty low in coastal areas, but again, they are limited into what they pay out. They only cover a couple $100,000, $250,000 or so for any kind of damage associated specifically with flooding. Again, not the general homeowners insurance. The Stafford Act is a very important piece of legislation that provides a number of different programs within the Stafford Act. There's individual and household assistance programs that provide maximum allowance for households of four, for example, of $28,000, which is a supplement to regular insurance. But there's the bigger part of the Stafford Act is the public assistance program. This is where governments turn to when their infrastructure gets damaged, and then the federal government will basically pay state and local government up to 75% of restoration costs, or 60% for new infrastructure costs associated with major disasters. They also have the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is Section 404 and 406, and allows for post-disaster mitigation investment. So when, again, a major disaster strikes, a Joplin, Missouri, a Hurricane Katrina, a major flooding in Louisiana, major flooding in Colorado, whatever it is, wildfires out west, earthquakes, both the Public Assistance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program of the Stafford Act helps get money into the hands of local governments for them to rebuild and repair their infrastructure. The Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 was one of several bills that amended the Stafford Act, and this added two new requirements for states. Number one, and this is important for those of you in this class, that states are required to prepare multi-hazard mitigation plans in order to be eligible for post-disaster assistance. So if a state does not have a multi-hazard mitigation plan, then they're not eligible for post-disaster assistance. And of course, no state's going to be in that situation. So of course, it basically, it's a carrot and a stick. It says, look, you need to, the stick is making sure you have these plans. The carrot is once you have the plans, then you could, be now all of a sudden, remain eligible for the hazard mitigation and post-disaster funding. And number two, it requires the states to prepare local hazard mitigation plans as a precondition for local government eligibility to receive hazard mitigation grants. So this now means that local governments and state governments are now required, as of 2000, to plan for disasters and plan for hazards. And that's vital. And that creates, in essence, a whole new set of opportunities for planners, emergency managers to work in making sure that these plans are done well. And this is what I imagine some of you guys will be doing. And maybe some of you are already doing it now in internships or full-time jobs, or if you're graduating soon, you could certainly go into this line of work. Now, as of 2000, over 20,000 local jurisdictions have locally adopted FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans. And the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 also created the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program. That provides some limited funding to award to local governments before a disaster strikes to make their communities more resilient for any kind of disaster that could occur. However, this funding pool is very limited. There's, probably should be more money put into this, but when times are tight, as they have been over the last, 15 years with, budgets, federal and state and local budgets, there's not as much funding in these programs as we would like to see. Now, September 11th really changed the way in which hazard planning was done. And the Homeland Security Act of 2002 was passed. It created first new agency, cabinet-level position in the U.S. in many decades. The Department of Homeland Security created the Transportation Security Administration, which anyone who's flown on a plane knows TSA. They're the ones that check our bags, make us take our shoes off, make sure that all of our airlines are obviously free of any kind of terrorism, which is good, but obviously has come at an expensive cost. And September 11th, the Homeland Security Act 2002 created an all hazards shift. FEMA previously just focused on natural hazards. This became a bit of a pendulum. So after September 11th, the field of emergency management pendulum swung towards more of the terrorism side of things, as opposed to the natural disaster sides of things. But then with Hurricane Katrina and certainly Hurricane Sandy and other natural disasters, the pendulum has started to swing back more towards the center or more back towards the natural hazards. I mean, we certainly haven't gotten rid of the TSA or any of the Homeland Security sorts of requirements in the federal legislation, but we are now once again starting to look at natural disasters because, frankly, we were unprepared when Hurricane Katrina struck August 29, 2005. Our country, whole profession of emergency management really shifted into the terrorism mindset, and we let our guard down in terms of a major natural disaster, and Hurricane Katrina exposed how dangerous that could be. So after Hurricane Katrina, there was the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, and that also amended the Stafford Act, but it also amended the Homeland Security Act and other disaster laws. It enabled the president to move quicker in responding to a major disaster. Now remember, the National Response Framework cites that all disasters are local. So during Hurricane Katrina, George Bush, President Bush, noted that he hadn't been called by Governor Blanco, the governor of the state of Louisiana at the time, to request assistance. So he couldn't just come in and help unless, until the governor actually put in a formal request. But this post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act started to change some of those and allowed the president to move quicker into a major disaster to respond. It also restored FEMA as a distinct entity within the Department of Homeland Security with direct access to the president during emergencies. Previously, FEMA had been relegated to a relatively unimportant agency that was real buried down deep into the bureaucracy of the federal government. And this raised the importance of FEMA once again to respond to natural disasters, and it enabled FEMA to work more on housing recovery issues, because after a major natural disaster like flooding such as Katrina, housing becomes one of the most important issues. Where are the people going to live? They're in shelters for a period of time, but after that, being able to get back into a home is one of the most important things to be able to get life back to normal. Superstorm Sandy, struck October 22nd, 2012. Again, another example of the pendulum shifting back more towards the natural hazard side. And the Boulder, Colorado floods of September 9, 2013 was another major example. So let's listen a little bit now to the author of our book, Jim Schwab, interviewing the mayor of Boulder, Colorado, talking about the floods that affected Boulder.
Hello, this is Jim Schwab, manager of APA's Hazards Planning Research Center. And with me here in Broomfield, Colorado is Matthew Applebaum, who's the mayor of Boulder. Boulder experienced some serious flooding, like many Colorado communities, last September 2013. And what I'd like to, I know your time is precious, and so we want to sort of turn you loose to tell your own story. Really like to kind of focus on what Boulder had learned over the years about sort of pre-planning for this kind of an event, what value that pre-planning turned out to have, and some of the recovery stories since then. You've got kind of 9 months into what surely is going to be a recovery that lasts longer than that.
I mean, Boulder has been working at mitigating the impacts of flooding through the city for as long as I can remember, certainly decades. And we are, for all of Boulder's wonders, we are considered to be the number one most hazardous place in the state of Colorado for flooding, and that's simply because we are right up against the foothills, right at the mouth of the canyon. Boulder Creek comes right through the city, but there are also these 15 tributary creeks that come down out of the mountains as well. And I think it's not that they are themselves the most dangerous, it's that they go through populated and business areas very quickly as they leave the mouth of the canyon. Very valuable real estate, a lot of people, a lot of jobs, a lot of roads and so on. So I think that makes us the most hazardous or dangerous.
More property at risk.
Yeah, a lot more property at risk, a lot more people at risk. University is there and so on. So this is hardly news to us, although I think for a number of years people focused on Boulder Creek, and we have still focused on Boulder Creek, and didn't think quite so much about all those tributary creeks, which often are dry or nearly dry when there isn't some serious flood event. For the last 30 years at least, we really have been looking at all of them, and a combination of strict regulation. Yes, a little after the fact in some cases, people had already built things, but very strict regulation, even above and beyond the FEMA requirements. We have our own high hazard zone and so on, as well as a lot of mitigation work. We have we're well known for a greenway system, which most people in Boulder and around the country look at in terms of, wow, they built this great system for moving bicycles and people, and that's true. But in fact, we sneakily did it as part of a flood mitigation program where we actually have 79 underpasses in Boulder, which is pretty amazing for a city our size. The large majority of those are along the creekways, and not only do they serve the transportation needs, the mobility needs, but they are also part of the mitigation package. And I also think, and this decision I was part of back in the mid-'80s, at least somebody lobbying on behalf of keeping these creekways natural, not concreting them, not doing structural improvements except perhaps at certain roadway underpasses. And by keeping them more natural, we slow down the water, we spread it out more, and we reduce the level of damage. We've also engaged in a very expensive program of buying up property, the most serious, most hazardous property. And that's not just because it takes a house or a business out of the floodplain. It also means there's less potential debris to fall into the creeks and block things up, because blockage is in many ways the most important and the most dangerous part of the flooding. So we've done a large number of things over the years, including education. And that's been recognized by FEMA. We've gotten discounts for the city. We have mapped and remapped and re-remapped our floodways. We try to keep current. We try to use the latest technologies, even though sometimes politically that's a little difficult. People don't like being told they're in a floodplain, but nonetheless, you have to use the best science. So on the mitigation portion, we've done a lot. And we have a deep plan for flooding, although it's important to point out that the planning we've done, by and large, has been for what I guess one might call a traditional flood, the 100-year flood in one of these tributaries, where you get, I know for Boulder Creek, it's 3 inches in an hour of rain in the drainage way above Boulder Creek. And in fact, in last September, that's not at all what we got. In fact, in no place did we get the traditional amount of rain. What we got was this totally unpredicted and unprecedented, at least in the modern era, of 18 inches of rain spread out over 5 days and affecting all of the creekways. And although Boulder Creek was somewhat spared, it had the effect of shutting down the city, shutting down the county, because it was so widespread. And nobody expected that. And arguably nobody planned for that, at least not in quite the way it played out. Now, having said that, our mitigation efforts certainly helped. We got a lot less damage than we otherwise would have had, and a lot less damage than many surrounding communities. Nonetheless, I think it's safe to say we hadn't quite planned for this. And it showed in a couple of places where we were at risk because we hadn't thought that such an event was really going to happen. Well, let me just stop there and see where you want to take it.
It illustrates the fact you can plan for a number of things, but you can't plan for everything. So once you have that reality and you know what has actually happened, then it gets into time for how do we plan the recovery?
Right.
How do we put things back together again? And what are we trying to achieve?
Right. So, I mean, the other thing I would say that was really unexpected is the amount of flood damage that was caused not by flood waters themselves, but by rising groundwater. And in fact, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but I would guess that a very high percentage of the houses and businesses that were damaged, it was due to rising groundwater. These are places that aren't in any floodplain. They're not in any map floodplain. They will never be in any map floodplain, honestly, because there's just not their location. So, I mean, back to recovery efforts. So, I mean, I think, And the city manager for our government, the city manager really operationally runs the city. City council certainly sets policies. We worry about budget. We worry about what our focus is. We worry about priorities. But the city manager and the city staff team really work on the day-to-day implementation, and I think they've done a fabulous job. Now, from a kind of high-level policy, I think things we have done well are some level of education, getting the costs of flood insurance down because we've met the various FEMA criteria, so that helps both citizens and businesses in town. That's positive. Again, the mitigation we did reduced the level of damage to, I think, a fairly large extent. The fact that we have very significant reserves in the city of Boulder, and we are very conservative fiscally, and we have sufficient reserves that we could be out there immediately, repairing, replacing, helping people out, made a very big difference. There are many communities that don't have that for various reasons. Sometimes they're just very small and they really can't maintain that level. Sometimes they just have chosen other priorities. But given how long it takes for state and federal money to flow, having those reserves lets you get out there and start fixing things literally on day one, and that's important. Great cross-jurisdictional relationships. This is an event that obviously affected not just the city, but the whole county and many other communities much harder than we did. But from the very beginning, all through the floods and the immediate dealing with the hazard, but then the aftermath, there's been great cooperation with the folks at the county in terms of, well, really everything, in getting things fixed and working with the federal government jointly. We were out in Washington with them and all the other cities talking to our congressional representatives. And we were not there saying, hey, I want more money than the other guy. I mean, because I was at some of these meetings, we were there saying, this affected all of us. We need some help. We will make sure it's allocated fairly. Don't worry about that. We understand that some of the small communities really need help more than the city of Boulder does. And we work and continue to work incredibly well together. And I don't think that can be said necessarily everywhere else. So that is critical. And then within the city, it was critical that the various departments worked well together. I mean, this flooding obviously affected Public Works and Transportation and all of our utilities and our open space department. And again, everybody coordinated, everybody collaborated. You didn't see kind of people going in different directions. Everybody was helping everybody else out with whatever equipment that they had, whatever staff they had. It really was a truly collaborative effort. We worked with human service organizations, of course. We worked with the state. We worked with, all the entities that were involved, and I think did a good job. Now, 9 months later, the city still hasn't repaired everything on its list, but we've done a good job. The roads were fixed up pretty quickly. Open space still has a lot of damage that needs to be dealt with. Utilities has a lot of damage that needs to be dealt with. And in fact, the council is going to have to decide about raising some of the utility fees much higher, at a much higher rate than we normally would. And I think there is great interest in that so that we can not just fix some of the damage, but in fact do some of the mitigation work that's been on our list for a long time, and we've just been slowly doing it because we don't want to hit people with big increases. But I think we believe the political climate now is that people get it, that preventive measures save a significant amount of money later on. I was going to say downstream, which is a horrible pun. Preventive measures save money later on, and so it is worth the investment in infrastructure in order to do that. But the community, a lot of people are still hurting, and we also recognize that although Boulder is a relatively wealthy community, there are many people who are not wealthy and who don't have the means, who got damaged in the flood, particularly renters who didn't have any insurance. And we need to make sure in the short run we help them out, but in the long run that we do a better job of making sure that they can bounce back from events like this just as quickly as folks who do have more economic resiliency. So resiliency is the watchword. I guess that's what I'll end this on. Boulder was chosen by the Rockefeller Foundation as one of the 100 resilient cities worldwide, and we are going to have a real focus on resiliency for the next 2 years, more so than ever before. And part of that, obviously, is how do you recover from these events, and how do you make yourself more resilient? How do you make yourself as a community more able to bear these shocks, to kind of deflect some of the impacts, and to make sure that you're in a position to limit the damage and limit the effect and get back on your feet as quickly as possible, better than ever. So that is a focus for us.
So the Boulder is a good case example of a community that is really doing a lot, experienced a major disaster with the floods, but they had been doing a lot beforehand to promote hazard mitigation in many senses, and obviously there were some benefits that the city found, the mayor identified as a result of the floods and of the result of the hazard mitigation that was discovered during the floods, and talked through a lot of those experiences and examples. The National Disaster Recovery Framework has, there's short-term, intermediate, and long-term scales. And this right here, this graphic provides examples of the different short-term recovery, intermediate recovery, and long-term recovery examples. So pre-disaster preparedness examples include pre-disaster recovery planning, mitigation planning and implementation, community capacity and resilience building, conducting disaster preparedness exercises, partnership building, articulating protocols and disaster plans for services to meet the emotional health and health care needs of adults and children. Then, of course, there is the disaster itself. And then in the short-term recovery, there's mass care and sheltering needs. There's debris removal. There's obviously needs for businesses and public health and healthcare and mitigation activities. In the intermediate recovery steps, you have housing needs, more debris and infrastructure issues, business needs, emotional, psychological concerns, public health and healthcare, obviously, again, and mitigation activities. During the long-term recovery, you have, again, more housing needs, infrastructure needs, business needs, emotional and psychological needs, public health and healthcare needs ongoing, and mitigation activities. Hurricane Harvey was one of the most devastating hurricanes ever to hit the United States, flooding Texas recently. And the recovery is going to take many, many years, according to Brock Long, the director of FEMA. Let's hear quickly from what Brock has to say.
We're back with the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Brock Long joins us from their headquarters in Washington. It's been a very busy time for you, sir. I appreciate you making the time. Can you tell us, the White House has already asked for about $7 billion. Expect billions more to be needed in Houston quite soon. How much money does FEMA need to help this recovery?
That's hard to estimate right now. Obviously, not only is the president fully engaged, his staff, Tom Bossert, Secretary Duke, all of us are working together to correctly inform the Congress on how to give us the enduring authority to go forward to make sure that we meet the demands for not only Harvey, but potentially threatening Irma out there as well. So I feel like what we have going on right now is an excellent communication, with the Congress, and the Congress knows what needs to be done to make sure that we can meet the demands of what's going on.
You mentioned Irma. It appears to be strengthening. What are you expecting from that hurricane?
Well, what bothers me about Irma and what we need the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and folks down in southeastern United States as well as the Mid-Atlantic is that anytime a hurricane has a well-defined center of circulation, the confidence in that forecast track is pretty high when it comes from the National Hurricane Center. The models are in pretty good agreement. Right now, we are ramping up. We've already forward deployed commodities into our island territories, where we've already forward deployed incident management teams to Puerto Rico as well as the Virgin Islands. So we're shifting focus to Irma, as well as maintaining the effort to make sure that we have Recovery Command established in Texas and Louisiana.
Now, when it comes to Harvey, 33 trillion gallons of water dumped on U.S. soils has been called a 1 in 1,000 year event. Do we need to be prepared for more extreme weather like this? And is the onus on the states rather than the federal government?
So I think that's an excellent question. And I need state representatives and state legislative officials and local elected officials to listen up. This is a call. It is a wake-up call for this country, for local and state elected officials to give their governors and their emergency management directors, the full budgets that they need to be fully staffed, to design rainy day funds, to have your own standalone individual assistance and public assistance programs. This is a wake-up call. People cannot depend solely on the Federal Emergency Management Agency to be responsible for a majority. States do a lot of work. They do a lot of work, but I think that we all have to collectively sit down after this event and figure out how to collectively improve. As we've all seen.
Are you saying there, sir, that Texas should have done more to prepare?
No. Texas is a model. Governor Abbott, Chief Nim Kidd, those guys are a model. What we need are for elected officials at all levels of government to hit the reset button, sit down, evaluate where their programs are with their state emergency management directors as well as their local emergency management directors, and make sure that they have everything they need to increase their levels of self-sufficiency. This is a partnership, but this event is one that we're all going to have to sit down and hit the reset button on and figure out how we collectively improve.
Your agency oversees the National Flood Insurance Program, which is going to expire at the end of the month unless Congress acts. About 80% or more people in the area hit by Harvey don't have any flood insurance. What are you expecting? Are people there basically on their own?
No, people are. It's tough. So, individual assistance that's offered up by the Federal Emergency Management Agency is basically just a ray of hope. It's a bridge to kickstart recovery. Those who are uninsured are most likely eligible for FEMA's individual assistance program that can help them with a host of things, not only rapid repairs to their homes, maybe some funding for if they've lost their jobs and different things, or rental fees and that kind of thing that they can pay. The bottom line is that it's not going to be enough to make anybody whole. The other thing is that in this country, federal disaster recovery support comes from a multitude of agencies. Also, the SBA will be offering up low-interest loans to those as well, because they have a disaster declaration. HUD funding kicks in. So what we have to do is help citizens understand what they're entitled to kickstart their recovery.
Brock Long at FEMA. Good luck to you, sir.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment.
Brock used to be the emergency management director for the state of Alabama. I've actually met with him several times. He was a speaker at a conference I organized a few years ago. Very competent individual, understands emergency management and disaster recovery very well. This is the end of the Unit 3 lecture. Thank you very much. Next unit will be long-term recovery planning and plan implementation.